Good afternoon to all of you. I would like to welcome all of you for this seminar on Adam Smith. And the seminar has two specialties. One is that it is being hosted as part of the MIDS Golden Jubilee celebrations. MIDS has successfully completed 50 years of its academic journey, and as you know, MIDS was established in the year 1971 by Professor Azim, who is a great educationist and development economist. And in 1977, MIDS was reconstituted as a national level institution supported by the ICSSR and Tamil Nadu government. And during this 50 years time period, we have produced kind of a lot of outputs, academic outputs. For example, we have produced around 270 working papers and equal number of books and around 3,500 journal articles and book chapters. Also, we have conducted several research methodology workshops, which is our flagship program actually, research methodology workshop, and other training programs. We have taken up various outreaching activities, and we have 15 faculty and 30 PhD students right now working on various aspects of social sciences. So I'd like to thank all those who have supported our journey and for the very fact that we have been able to accomplish the objectives set by Professor Azim 50 years back. And the second speciality about this seminar is that this year is the tricentenary birth year of Adam Smith, the father of economics. So some of us were discussing about it, and then we thought we can host a seminar on Adam Smith at MIDS. And the immediate name that came onto my mind is Dr. Alex from Azim Premji University. Dr. Alex is the rarest of the rare species in economics because he teaches economic thought, history of economic thought. If you just count the number of people who are capable of teaching history of economic thought, it's very, very meager actually. For example, we used to have Professor Rajan at IIT Chennai, and then Professor our own former director, Professor Neelakandan, I don't know why I not able to reconcile. So both of them are no more. But we have Professor Ram Gopal, who has been teaching history of economic thought for quite some time, and he could not come for this seminar. And then we have Professor Alex in South India, focusing on history of economic thought. So Professor Alex is also teaching macroeconomics. Very recently published a book entitled Macroeconomics, an Introduction, which was translated in Tamil also. It's a very kind of very classic book in the sense that it talks about the Indian macroeconomics with a lot of kinds of examples, data from Indian context. So apart from this book, he has also published books on heterodox economics, things like that. So he is unique in the sense that he is well versed with the history of economic thought, and therefore he is the right person to be here to talk about Adam Smith. He has published a series of articles on Adam Smith also. Some of the copies of these articles are being circulated here. So I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Alex to deliver this talk on the sociological Smith. So basically, Smith is a kind of multifaceted person. He's a philosopher, he's an economist, he's a psychologist actually. Now, behavioral economists are taking inputs from his theory of moral sentiments, which was published in the year 1759. And so Smith is considered to be the kind of founder of behavioral economics. So now today we are going to listen to Dr. Alex, who is going to introduce Smith as a sociologist. Dr. Alex, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Venkat. I'm happy to be here again. Because the last time we came, it was to talk about the macroeconomics book and the Tamil translation. So actually, I think a few months ago, we were talking about how this is the 300th birth anniversary of Adam Smith, and maybe we need to do something about it. So it's good to see that multiple institutions are hosting lectures on this, and I hope that this will just be a beginning and there'll be more interest in the work of Adam Smith. And I just wanted to also mention that although I work on the history of economic thought, now that I have a job, I think that I can be confident, but very often people are reluctant to pursue a PhD in the history of economic thought, fearing that one might not get a job. So I think that I just wanted to acknowledge that. So we don't know the birth date of Adam Smith, right? So what we have data or what we know is actually that he was baptized on the 5th of June, and this is from the National Records of Scotland. I don't know if what is visible. So on the left you have the name of the parents. It's Adam Smith and Margaret Douglas, and the first name given, which is Adam again, and on the right you have the witnesses. So this is from the parish records. Right? So the birth date is not known, and so what we are here to celebrate is really the 300th birth anniversary of Smith. I think that the year 2023 for the historians of economic thought is also important for other two reasons. One is, I don't know whether this name William Petty is familiar to some of you. He's also considered to be one of the initial people to have contributed to the thinking around national income statistics. And he was born on 26th May 1623, so this makes it the 400th birth anniversary. And Marx, this makes it the 140th death anniversary. I don't know, maybe there are more economists and classic cases which we can think of in 2023. But I think that whenever there's an anniversary, I feel it's a good occasion or it's some kind of a motivation to go back and read these texts. But I want to begin by talking a little bit about my own engagement with Adam Smith. I don't think one needs to go into the specifics of it, but I just want to mention a few things. One is that when I was doing my MPhil, I tried to engage with the economics that was there before Adam Smith, because although Adam Smith is considered to be the father of economics, I was very curious to find out what kind of economics existed before Adam Smith. And what was visible from that engagement is that Adam Smith brought together many of the elements that were already existing in the work of Petty, Cantillon, Francois Quesnay, the physiocrat. And then I've continued to engage with certain aspects of Smith, particularly his account of economic growth, and then also on education, a little bit about, and finally towards the end, I'm going towards the end there, I've looked at the question of whether there's any issue of aggregate demand deficiency, whether Smith has thought about that question, understood in the Keynesian perspective. And my answer is yes, to some degree. And currently I'm actually looking at, in classical economics, whether we have an account of taste formation. Because conventionally when we think of taste, this is not for sociologists, this is particular to economists. we think in terms of preferences, we think in terms of the rational utility maximizing individual. And what I wanted to look at is to see what are the classical economists saying about it. Is there a possibility to construct a theory of taste formation starting from social classes? So that's an ongoing work that I'm doing. So I've been engaging with Smith for quite a long time, and I think I'll continue to engage with Smith because as classic texts go, I think that whenever we read these texts, there's something new or interesting that we want to pursue. And I must also acknowledge that because I'm sure there are sociologists in this group, when I titled this talk, The Sociological Smith, what I really meant, the audience was primarily economists who have interpreted Smith in a particular way, and I wanted to highlight the sociological aspects. To begin with, I want to look at how Adam Smith is understood today, and this is taken from one of the newspapers, and I think it was the Economic Times. Very often, Smith is invoked along with the idea of the concept of the invisible hand. And I just want to read that bit in the first sentence. The unobservable market force that helps the demand and supply of goods in a free market to reach equilibrium automatically is the invisible hand. And subsequently it is mentioned that the phrase invisible hand was introduced by Adam Smith in his book, The Wealth of Nations. Now this is an extremely popular story of invisible hand and of Adam Smith, but unfortunately it is quite wrong. I want to highlight again three things here. One is that the invisible hand figures only once in The Wealth of Nations. And if you look at the corpus of Adam Smith's work, it figures only thrice. And it is not referring to the invisible hand as we understand it as the forces of supply and demand or of equilibrium. Right? It is understood in a very, very different way. But because of how it has been used or misused, this tends to be how Adam Smith is thought of today. And I would say a more recent kind of work, which is in the Palgrave Dictionary of Economics by Tony Aspromorgos, gives a very thorough account of how invisible hand is actually used in the context of Smith. It is talking about unintended consequences, yes, but it has got nothing to do with free market in the way it is understood in popular circles. It's got nothing to do with trickle-down economics. Right? So it needs to be studied more carefully. I think another quote which just came to my mind is, "In the long run, we are all dead," which is ascribed to Keynes. Again, it is not something, it's not got anything to do with the idea of the long run in general, but it's a specific context that Keynes is referring to. And very often these things are repeated without paying enough attention to the context in which they are being written. Adam Smith, yes, spoke about the benefits of competition, spoke about the benefits of the market, but the context, the historical context becomes important because the context is mercantilism, and Smith was critical of mercantilism because the big state, the big government, and let's say big corporations came together. The East India Company being a foremost example, where that is what Smith was against. So big corporations plus the government coming together, and in that context Smith said that how can small capitalists or small firms enter the market, and demonstrated some of the benefits of that. And very often because of Adam Smith being seen as a free market champion, Smith is sometimes often also invoked to argue for private education. But even here we need to be a bit careful and cautious because for Smith, education is something that he thinks everybody should have access to. And I'll talk a little bit more specifically about education later. But Smith also had experience of going to a private university and a public university, and he found that the private university teachers were teaching better. So a little bit of his personal experience also gets into his understanding of how education should be conceptualized and how education should be financed. So to sum up, I think the idea of Smith as being a champion of free market, as being somebody who introduced the idea of invisible hand to suggest, again, free market or trickle down, is not really borne out by the textual evidence. And before we move ahead, I want to talk about why maybe Smith is understood in this way. Why is Smith seen as a champion of free market? And I think part of the reason is what is taught in economics as the mainstream. And when people think of economics, people immediately think of supply and demand. And I've put that supply and demand schedules at the top right corner. Thinking of supply and demand as schedules is a relatively modern introduction or modern entry into how we understand economics. In the work of Smith, there are discussions of supply and there are discussions of demand, but it has got nothing to do with these kinds of supply and demand schedules that we see in modern economics textbooks today. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but let me highlight some of the aspects of what is dominant understanding of economics today and who are some of the people associated with that. Marginalist economics, or sometimes called neoclassical economics, and I think that the term neoclassical economics is actually historically, I would say, inaccurate in this sense, in an analytical sense, because neoclassical economics is actually a break away from classical economics. It's a completely different paradigm, and they cannot really be seen as an improvement over the other. The people who were involved in this marginalist tradition, Jevons, Walras, and Menger, and subsequently Marshall, and say that in the economics profession, certainly Samuelson has a big role to play in popularizing the idea of marginalist economics, supply and demand, utility maximization, marginal cost, marginal revenue, Solow, and Mankiw. Now, Mankiw's textbooks are extremely popular, and what we see in Mankiw's textbook is a repetition of these principles of marginalist economics, right? And this is then taken over by mainstream textbooks. And what are some of the essential features of marginalism? First and foremost, it believes that the fundamental unit of analysis is an individual, what I call methodological individualism. It is also a science of choice, much like how Robbins would argue that you have unlimited wants, limited resources, and then you're trying to allocate your limited resources across different wants. The third point is supply and demand schedules. Now, this in a particular sense might seem very innocuous, harmless, but I think that supply and demand schedules understood in this way are particularly harmful, and if you want, we can have more discussion about it at the end of this lecture. But I just want to say that the assumptions that we impose on these supply and demand schedules, like they have to be convex, is a very strong assumption, and without these assumptions, you cannot have a unique and stable equilibrium point. Now, if you do not have an unique and stable equilibrium point, you cannot use this theory to explain anything. So it is the need of the theory to have unique and stable equilibrium points so that you can use it to explain economic phenomena. The other two key aspects are, what is the theory of income distribution? So if you ask an economist who is trained in the mainstream way, they would tell you that in equilibrium, wage equals the marginal product of labor. Now, if some of this is not known to you, I would think it's a good thing, right? Because it's only when many economists are trained, I would say, incorrectly or uncritically, and that can be a problem. But if you haven't heard of the marginal productivity theory of income distribution, it's probably a good thing. But essentially what it says is that in equilibrium, under conditions of competition, wage equals the marginal product of labor, and the rate of profit equals the marginal product of capital. And what you also have is a supply side growth theory, essentially some kind of Say's law, which states that supply creates its own demand. And it is interesting to notice that Solow won the Nobel Prize for his contribution to growth theory which is essentially a supply-side growth theory, which also assumes some kind of Say's law. The reason in which Solo assumes Say's law is because it's a single commodity model, and either you consume or you save. Right? So it's built on a single commodity model. Having said this, now I think that we can get a little more in depth into Smith. I think that today when people try to understand Smith, there are some questions. Do we look at his analytical framework? There is a particular conceptual framework that Smith has. Do we look at his policy recommendations? Do we study his historical context? So there are multiple ways in which we can study Smith, and some people try to ask this question: what would Smith think of Indian economy today? Personally, that is not a question that I am interested in, and what I am going to do today is really look at the analytical framework. Right? So different scholars have done different things. Some people focus on policy recommendations, some people focus on the historical context, and then try to situate Smith's economic theories there. But the more important question is what kind of lens to use. How do we read Adam Smith? Suppose you are trained in marginalist economics and supply and demand schedules. If I go back and look at Adam Smith, what I will see is an inferior version of Mankiw. Or maybe that's not, or I might say that you might see an inferior version of Alfred Marshall, or an inferior version of Paul Samuelson. Right? Because what we think is the pinnacle of economic knowledge is driven by what is the dominant paradigm, and the dominant paradigm is marginalism, where we have supply and demand schedules, marginal productivity theory, and then the inescapable conclusion might become that Smith is a forerunner of marginalist economics, or Smith is an inferior version of the economics that we have today. So then what the entire project becomes to show how Smith's ideas have been improved upon by subsequent economists. But this is not the reality. The reality is that there are multiple paradigms in economic thought, and if that is the case, there are multiple paradigms or contending paradigms in economic thought. How do we understand Smith? And in fact, I just want to say an aside here that which lens to use is extremely important, whatever text we look at. And I was looking at some of the secondary literature on Arthashastra, and people have tried to argue that in Arthashastra you can see optimal taxation, you can see efficiency curves, and to me that I don't think there's any connection. It is a text written in a different time with different kind of a conceptual framework. And sometimes historians of thought try to push the dominant paradigm onto that kind of a thinking. And this is something that we have to be cautious about. So it is in this context that I want to sort of talk about the sociological Smith, again understood in a limited sense with the intended audience as economists and not larger social scientists. And to start off by Smith's definition of political economy, where he writes that it is to provide plentiful revenue or subsistence for the people, or more properly to enable them to provide such revenue or subsistence for themselves. Right? So it is very clear in Smith that the primary objective is to provide plentiful revenue or subsistence for the people. And again, this has to be contrasted often with the mainstream idea of Smith, where he's seen as a champion of free market or trickle-down economics, but it's not that. He thought that this is the central objective of political economy. How can we characterize Adam Smith's approach to economics? And here, let me just highlight three things here. One is methodological holism. That is, the fundamental unit of analysis is a social class. So, in Smith, this social class could be the landowner, it could be the emerging capitalist, and the workers. In Smith, you also find a labor theory of value, which says I'm not going to get into the specifics of it, but somehow labor goes in, the quantity of labor that is used up goes into the determination of value or prices of commodities. And remember that this is methodological holism is very different from marginalist economics, methodological individualism. And in marginalist economics, the chief determinant of value or price is utility, or more specifically, marginal utility. Whereas what you have in Smith is labor. Again, very different. The third concept that is important to understand Smith is the idea of the social surplus. One way to understand the social surplus is to think of it as some kind of a GDP measure, but what it says is that after replacement requirements of the economy are met, what is left over is understood to be the social surplus, and this can then be distributed to capitalists and landowners. It's distributed in the form of profits and rents, and the government can tax the surplus. The idea of social surplus is particularly important because in ManQ, or any kind of mainstream textbook, there is no surplus in the mainstream theory because of the product exhaustion theorem, or what is called the Euler's theorem, which says that when output is produced, you are paying a necessary compensation to workers, you are paying a necessary compensation to capitalists, and nothing is left over. Right? Nothing is left over also means that there is no particular role for the government, and in fact, the implication from the mainstream supply and demand schedule framework is that if the government intervenes by setting a minimum wage, it means it leads to unemployment. This kind of a implication arises because of the particular way in which supply and demand curves are set up. So minimum wages are bad for the economy, and that is the particular implication. What you find in Smith is a theory of income distribution and a theory of growth. And very often people have tried to interpret Smith's theory of growth as talking about very supply side measures or talking about the division of labor. Right? So division of labor is some kind of account of productivity, labor productivity. And if there's an increase in labor productivity, it leads to economic growth. It's some notion of technological progress also there. But from my reading of Smith, which I'll get to a little later, there is evidence that he thought that the increase in labor productivity or the improvement in division of labor will be constrained by the extent of the market. And the extent of the market can be understood as some kind of a Keynesian aggregate demand constraint. The two books which I think are of central importance to, as Professor Venkat also mentioned, the Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations, and I think that they need to be read together. The reason I've put up this book on the right, this was published by Tony Aspromorgos in 2009, and to me this is a very detailed account of Smith's work, which also looks at the historical context in which Smith is writing. It also looks at how Smith has used certain words, not just invisible hand, but productive labor, concepts of value, all those in the framing of political economy. And so if you are interested in a thorough scholarly engagement of Smith's political economy, I would certainly recommend this book. So now I'm going to get into the specifics of it. So talk a little bit about education. So these are some of the themes that I have engaged with as well. So I'm going to speak to that. How do we understand Smith's conception of education? And that is what I broadly mean by the philosophy of education. And the second question is, how did Smith think education should be provided? Should it be subsidized by the state? Should it be done by private players? What was Smith's view on that? And this is a quote from The Wealth of Nations, where Smith writes that the education of the common people requires, perhaps in a civilized and commercial society, the attention of the public. So this, and why is Smith saying this? Right? Why is Smith saying that education to some degree should be publicly supported? One is because Smith believes that there are moral and social benefits. And one of the moral and social benefits is directly from what kind of values that education is able to create. And particularly he highlights moral sentiments. Moral sentiments for Smith includes things like duty, sympathy, and other positive attitudes, or let's say just say moral sentiments. And this he argues comes from education, and for Smith education was not just limited to schooling, but he also thought about how parents would teach their children too. So sympathy and self-respect as being important aspects of a civilized society. He also believed that if we have to have democracy in the economy or in the country, then it is important that people are educated so that they can choose their votes carefully or in an informed manner. The final point for Smith as to why he believed that education is necessary for all is because he believed that when people engage in the division of labor, we repeat the tasks over and over and over again. And this, he believed, would have some kind of negative effects on our cognitive abilities. And so he believed that to offset some of the negative effects of the division of labor, it is important that people are educated. I also want to highlight here that this notion of education that we find in Smith is not the same as the public good argument. And let me just repeat what the public good idea or argument is. It says that if the private sector cannot provide a particular commodity in an efficient manner, or it's not able to account for the positive externalities or not able to account for negative externalities, then the government has to step in and provide that commodity. Right? So the first responsibility for provision of a commodity rests with the private players. If the private sector cannot do it because of externalities and other things, then the government can step in. This kind of a conception of a public good has to be seen to be very different from conceptually this idea of education that we find in Smith. It has got nothing to do with efficiency argument, it has got nothing to do with the externality argument. It is a different way of thinking about it. However, it is true that if you look at the policy implications of both these conceptions, they can coincide. Even from the public good argument, you can arrive at public provision of education. Even from a Smithian understanding of education, you can arrive at a public provision of education. But analytically speaking and philosophically speaking, they are distinct ways to think about education. How did Adam Smith view wages? Right. Now, again, today, if we ask an economics student and an economist how wages are determined, they would argue that it is determined in the labor market by the intersection of the supply and demand for labor. Again, the supply and demand for labor they have to satisfy certain properties so that you can get an equilibrium real wage. And in that labor market, your quantity of labor employment is also determined. So both the real wage and employment is determined in the labor market. In other words, we can argue that wages is endogenously determined in the labor market, according to Mankiw and according to marginalist economics. But in the work of Adam Smith, wages are determined very differently. One is that he argues that it is customary subsistence. So the term customary is very important here because this has to be distinguished from biological subsistence. Now, for a person to survive, we need certain number of calories. Right? That is a particular idea of biological subsistence. But for Smith, wages are determined by customary subsistence. It means that it is much more socially determined and much more flexible in nature. Right? And I want to highlight the quote there, that a society is flourishing and happy only when the workers are tolerably well fed, clothed and lodged, and not when they are poor and miserable. And in Smith, it's very clear that wages cannot be determined through any formula. Economists sitting anywhere in the world cannot say this is how wages have to be determined. Smith believes that wages are determined due to cultural and social factors. In other words, it cannot be reduced to any kind of supply and demand schedule kind of thing, and it has to be understood more contextually or locally or socially. That's the first point. The second point, very often when we think of Adam Smith as a champion of free market, is that Adam Smith very clearly understood the role of power in an economy. Right? And this particular quotation from Wealth of Nations it's very clear that he understands that the capitalist or the employers had more power than the workers. And let me just read this quotation now. The workmen desire to get as much, the masters to give as little as possible. The former are disposed to combine in order to raise, the latter in order to lower the wages of labor. Right? So there are two things. One is that Smith recognizing the power or the conflict between workers and capitalists here. But secondly, Smith also recognizing that employers come together to reduce the wages of workers. And I can think of an aside where I think the Federation of Indian FICCI had some role to play in how the category of workers was being defined. And if I'm not mistaken, domestic servants were not included in the Minimum Wages Act or in the larger Trade Union Act because of the role FICCI played. So chambers of Indian industries have a particular union, just like workers have a particular union, and their interests are conflicted in nature. And what I want to highlight from here is this, that Smith conceptualized or analyzed the society in terms of social classes, also recognizing structural power. So it is one thing to say that Smith certainly recommended competition and more competition, given that the government and big capitalists were colluding and he wanted to break that. But Smith also equally recognized the ill effects of division of labor. Smith also recognized the power relations that existed between capitalists and workers. And in this particular article that I had written, what I tried to do was bring together Smith's views on wages and education, particular context of India. And the motivation was the following. Very often we have a wages policy that is, let's say, undertaken by a separate ministry. We have an education policy which is taken separately. But I think that if, going by Smith, if education has to be accessible for all, the discussions around minimum wage have to include the cost of education. And when we are thinking of education for all, it has to have an understanding of what minimum wages are or what the average wages are. And we cannot try to separate them all out, and there has to be more a holistic understanding of how they come together. The idea of demand, I want to highlight the idea of demand here only because the mainstream understanding of Smith is to view him as a supply side economist. And from my reading, what I've tried to demonstrate is that there is there are interesting things in Smith which give somewhat of a different role to demand. First and foremost is this concept effectual demand. And when people have tried to look at the history of effective demand, which Keynes uses in 1936, people have gone back and said there is a similar kind of term in Malthus. People have gone back and said there's a similar term in Adam Smith, although the term in Adam Smith is very different from the way Keynes uses it. And effectual demand or demand in Smith is not a demand schedule or a demand curve, but he's talking about it as something like a point. Right? That kind of a schedule idea does not exist in Smith, and he argues that this is socially determined. And what are some of the determinants of this effectual demand? He argues that ranks, where the social ranks in a society, taste, customs, and habits. Right? So again, all these highlighting a more sociological reading of Adam Smith's economics itself. And I want to share this quotation from the theory of moral sentiments, which talks about emulation. Again, very often when economists think about emulation, economists might stop at Veblen. Right? Veblen is writing around the 1900s, and he is famous for his idea of the theory of the leisure class, or the idea of conspicuous consumption. But there's no tendency to go back, but probably that's okay. But I just want to highlight this quote from the theory of moral sentiments here, because this is particularly what I'm working on now, to see is there any account of taste formation in the work of Smith and other classical economists. And just to highlight that there is emulation which happens between different ranks of people, ranks again having a strong sociological basis. The second point I want to highlight here is Smith's understanding of necessaries, which has a role to play in customary subsistence, which has a role to play in the determination of wages. Right? So, and this is what I meant when I said that for Smith, customary subsistence or subsistence does not refer to biological subsistence. Right? And let me just read this out. By necessaries, I understand not only the commodities which are indispensably necessary for the support of life, but whatever the custom of the country renders it indecent for creditable people, even of the lowest order, to be without. So it makes the determination of necessaries much more social and local. And Smith would also think that in a particular country it's possible to have multiple customary subsistence existing, right? Because it depends on the space and time. But one more thing I feel this kind of understanding of wages allows us to do. This kind of a historical, sociological understanding of wages allows us to do, at least in the Indian context, is that I think that this offers a better understanding of wage differentials across gender, across caste, across religion, right? Because this can easily account for it. Whereas if you take the mainstream interpretation of how wages are determined, people need to bring in all kinds of things into that to be able to make certain claims. And also I think that one of the other things that we can highlight from here, although I don't think Smith talks about it, is that people who are in power can also determine what the custom of the country is. Right? I don't think we need to keep that away from this kind of understanding. Now I'm getting into, what I spoke about was education, the idea of demand, how wages are determined, just three things in Smith to give you a flavor of what Smith said and how fundamentally different it is from mainstream economics. Right? And also to show how Smith has a different way of thinking about the economy, and perhaps, according to me, more useful than the mainstream one. What I'm going to do now is to situate Smith's economics a little bit between Cantillon, who is writing before Smith, and Ricardo, who is writing after Smith, so that you get a flavor of, and you don't think that Smith came up with all these things on his own, and there were no one else who was writing about these things. And what I have put there is actually the Scottish Enlightenment and the people involved in the Scottish Enlightenment. So Smith was very much a product of the Scottish Enlightenment, and you can see Smith is the third figure there. And some of you, I am only familiar with David Hume, who is standing next to Smith, and Smith and Hume also corresponded. So I think that if one has to really understand Smith's intellectual context, one needs to also look at the Scottish Enlightenment, apart from, let's say, looking at Cantillon and Ricardo, which is what I'm going to do today. So just a little bit of that context, and then I'll get into, I'll try to conclude my lecture. So in Cantillon is writing in 1755, and this is a recent edition of Cantillon's work, which is a variorum edition. which was published by Richard Vandenberg. Again, I think that there was a point in time where people used to bring out edited works so that other people could benefit from it. I think that today's maybe people's fascination with statistics and data work means that people are no longer trying to put together edited work or collected works together which can help other scholars. So within historians of economic thought, some people work to put these kind of scholarly editions possible, making it easier for some of us to work on their ideas. In Cantillon, wages are very clearly determined by customary subsistence. And in Cantillon, there is also a recognition that workers emulate landowners' consumption. And in Cantillon, there's a distinction that he makes between intrinsic value and natural price. So for Cantillon, value is determined by the land and labor that goes into the production of a commodity. Whereas in Smith, it is only labor. Whereas in Cantillon, there's land and labor. And then Cantillon tries to see how you can equate land and labor so that you can bring it to a common denominator. In Cantillon, there is also understanding of a social surplus, social class, and as I mentioned before, land and labor theory of value. So what you notice here is what I said before. Many of the elements that Smith is talking about is somewhat already there in Cantillon. Of course, Cantillon's work is nothing as holistic or analytically as articulate as the work of Smith. And this is just to reiterate what we said, that wage determination is customary. The distinction between necessaries, conveniences and luxuries is socially determined. There is a recognition of emulation in Smith's system. Smith distinguishes between natural and market prices, and there's a labor theory of value in Smith, and there's social surplus and social class. Now, what about Ricardo? Ricardo is writing in 1817 the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. On the question of wage determination, Ricardo writes that particularly it is not difficult to conceive that with better education and improved habits, a day's labor may become much more valuable, estimated even in what are now called the necessaries of the labor. In other words, suggesting that some kind of a link between education and necessaries, or education, necessaries and wages, but also suggesting that improved habits is a social concept that also having a role on how we understand necessaries. So just, of course, Ricardo is drawing on the work of Smith here. And in Ricardo, we also find this kind of distinction between necessaries, conveniences and luxuries. We also see social surplus, social class, labor theory of value. So if you actually look at the work of Cantillon, Smith and Ricardo, you notice that they are all using very similar concepts. And that is why Marx would later call all of them as classical political economists. And classical political economy has a different analytical framing than what I said in the beginning of marginalism, which comes from Jevons, Walras and Menger. They are distinct and contending paradigms. Both of them are trying to explain the same thing, but their mode of explanation, their basis of analysis are fundamentally different. And this is this Anthem Companion to Ricardo was published this year, and I've contributed an article which tries to situate Ricardo within the classical political economy tradition. So now to conclude, in a particular sense, most classical political economists are, I think, one of the maybe characteristic features of classical political economists is that they are not very narrowly economists. All of them have a broader historical, sociological understanding of phenomena. Right? So in that sense, maybe the title of my talk is not so surprising to most people, because if you are working in the tradition of classical political economy, there is necessarily a sociological aspect. What we find in Adam Smith, and I want to reiterate these things, is that Smith's economics or political economy is distinct from marginalist economics, and cannot be seen as a primitive version of mainstream economics. There is an understanding, and there is a conceptual understanding of social surplus, and the distribution of social surplus again cannot be reduced to any formula. It is fundamentally a political matter, right? Which means that it cannot be reduced to any kind of mathematical or statistical formula. And so in a sense, the classical political economy is deeply tied to the understanding of the social surplus and how the surplus has to be distributed. The fundamental unit of analysis is a social class, or another way of putting it is methodological holism, and it recognizes structural power in the society. And now this can vary. Now you can have different kind of arrangements where sometimes the landowners is more powerful than the capitalist. In other arrangements, the capitalist might be more powerful than the landowners. And I've also tried to show the link between, or some kind of a connection between Cantillon, Smith and Ricardo, and where Smith is drawing on Cantillon and Ricardo is drawing on Smith, and all three of them are contributing to what we today call as classical political economy. How do we understand ideas? And I think that this is really central. That the Smith in textbooks and newspapers, I think, is most often not the real Smith. Of course, people are writing under a lot of deadlines and people have to write articles in the newspapers, but I think that we need to be much more cautious, careful, and take time to engage with these ideas. The other point is that intellectual progress in economics is not linear. Right? It does not mean that if I want to understand something, I will just read Ricardo and not read Smith. Right? And some people think that you just need to read Marx, you don't need to read Ricardo or Smith, because Marx is right and therefore you just start from Marx. Some people think that Mankiw has said everything there is to be said, so you don't have to read anything before Mankiw. Right? All these, I think, are problematic ways of how we understand knowledge production. And knowledge production does not happen in a linear fashion. And what is dominant today is because some people who are in power are able to control what is supposed to be taught in universities. The theory of moral sentiments is a blueprint for society which is based on virtue and sympathy. So I think that this fits in very well with the broader political economy conception. And therefore, it is important that in our courses, in our engagement, we need to talk about ethics and economics. We cannot treat questions of ethics to be separate from this. And if you again, marginalist microeconomics does this in a very clever manner. It says that I am going to tell you about positive economics. Normative economics it's something else. Right? But I don't think we can make such a clean separation between normative and positive economics. Right? And in classical political economy, you cannot make something like that. Because of how the social surplus, the power relations that exist between social classes and all that. The Wealth of Nations can be seen as a manual as to how to achieve economic development. And in particular, today I've only focused on how wages are determined and the role of education. And I think that it is very important to read classics. I know it takes time, and in this age of Instagram and social media, we only want to read, I think, 250 characters. But I think that there is a different way of reading and a different way of engaging with these classics, because it really provides us with a holistic approach. It's not that we have to agree with anything that Smith said, or Ricardo said, or Marx said, or Keynes said, but it still gives you an analytical framework to understand the economic phenomena as a whole. So this is actually a much later addition to my slides, because Professor Venkat and I were talking today morning, and suddenly I thought that I should include this. What is the point of all this? Of course, I'm not suggesting that all of you look at Adam Smith, but I just wanted to list some possible research topics, or if you're a journalist, possible things to look at. And this is sad because we don't learn about the economists who are around us, or who were around us. Right? Including, let's say, Malcolm Adisheshai, who founded MIDS. And I've only spoken about people who have contributed to economics in Tamil Nadu here as a sample. One is that one could look at the economics of Ambirajan, who Professor Venkat already mentioned. He has an excellent book on classical political economy and the role of British policy in India. It's particularly important because he shows there how the policymakers, colonial administrators, misused Adam Smith's name and ideas to argue that when there is a famine, we will not intervene. Because Adam Smith said that market will take care of itself. So people are dying and Indians are saying that no, you have to intervene. But people have used ideas to whatever their ends. Maybe they believed it, maybe they used it so that they didn't want to intervene. But it's a very excellent, I think, scholarly work where economic history and history of ideas come together. And Ambirajan has also written an EPW article on Ambedkar's economics. Again, I think that very few people know that Ambedkar wrote 2 PhD theses in economics, one at Columbia University and other at London School of Economics. One was on monetary economics and the other was on public finance, broadly speaking, but more historical accounts. Right? So I think that if somebody were to look at Ambirajan's work, you can find interesting things. Gilbert Slater's contributions to economics, because subsequently what are called Slater villages have been resurveyed many times, but it would be very interesting to see what kind of methodological innovations Slater brought about. So this information actually I came across very recently while reading something on the history of Indian economic thought, where it was written that Sharada Raju was the first professional woman economist. I've put a question mark because I haven't verified it. It seems that she got the first PhD in economics in India, and it was from Madras University. And I was interested in this because she was supervised by P.J. Thomas, I think, who did his master's or BA from Tamil Nadu, but originally from Kerala. So what kind of contributions did Sharada Raju make? So she worked on Madras presidency. And the other one came up because I had recently just written an article, a survey article on the history of Indian economic thought. That is not my area of expertise. And I noticed that there were many associations, journals, local journals. Right? And I would be very interested, or people, it might be interesting to look at the history of the Journal of the Madras Economic Association. I know first we have to find those volumes and to see what kind of research was done. What was the kind of vision and what happened to these associations. So I hope that at least this will inspire some of you to work on these topics. And I just want to end by saying that if one is interested, there's also a book, actually 2 books, published on Adam Smith's library. Given that Smith read very widely, so you get an insight into the kind of books that he had access to and he probably used in his writing. So this was published by Cambridge University Press. Again, this gives I think a very interesting insight into the kind of intellectual engagement that Smith was able to have. Thank you.